Zizaran's interview with Path of Exile 2 game director Jonathan Rogers and game designer Hrishi was rife with thoughtful questions and impactful answers by the POE2 team. This video summarizes the entire 2-hour interview and provides some personal insight. Zizaran is one of the Path of Exile OGs, up there with the likes of Kriparian and Ziggy D. Without question, he is the largest streamer and content creator in the POE community, in terms of subscribers, views, and more. He's well built and he rocks blue hair sometimes. Jonathan Rogers is one of the co-founders of Grinding Gear Games, up there with the likes of Chris Wilson. He is the final decision maker on Path of Exile 2 design. Hrishi is a huge part of the GGG development team, primarily responsible for item design in POE1 and POE2. Additionally, he's one of the architects of Ruthless mode in POE1. Hold the pitchforks. He's awesome. For anyone who would like to watch the full interview between Ziz, Jonathan, and Hrishi, the link will be in this video's description. Remember, this is meant to be a summary, but I always recommend watching this type of content in full. Alright, without further ado, let's hop into all the questions and answers. Is everything going to be tied to maps like in POE1, or will there be standalone endgame? An example is Delve with no reliance on sulfite from maps. Jonathan responded and said it is possible, but there needs to be some sort of tie to economic value. There needs to be a trade-off in endgame. The mapping system works with this perfectly. The fear is repetition. They like ensuring diversity in content. Ziz followed up and said, loot is homogenized in PoE presently. You get loot from distinct systems and other unrelated systems. Will that continue in PoE2? They responded and said, we feel that tying specific rewards to a specific mechanic is vital, and they will be doing that in PoE2. Even in POE1, they're moving back to that sort of design. It's important for diversity of endgame. I'm also a huge fan of this, and I don't even play SSF, but I like going to different content types and getting different rewards. I feel like this continuing in POE2 and making those rewards more available is just a huge win overall, and I'd like to see this continue, and even shift up in Path of Exile 1 again. The next question. Much of the marketing is oriented toward a new crowd, but existing POE players are not being targeted. For example, we haven't seen endgame stuff yet. Will existing PoE players be targeted with POE2 marketing, with endgame, or complex interactions? They responded and said it's interesting because they do not want to alienate people who haven't heard of Path of Exile before. Thus, we ensure all is understandable as possible. They also already have a reputation of those who know about PoE being super complex. They want to try to tone it down a notch. They are confident existing POE1 players will try out POE2 already, so that's why they focus on POE2 being new player friendly. They are considering doing collab showcases with streamers to showcase endgame and endgame speed. They are still preparing for progression testing. That's coming soon, and endgame will arrive after. Me talking now. Yeah, 100%. They are right about that. Many POE1 players might say that they are not going to try POE2, but as soon as that game hits, you know that almost every single individual that has played POE1 before is going to hop into that first league and give it a go. It's free to play. It's not like a paid game such as Diablo 4 or even Last Epoch. It's completely free. You're going to have all your stash tabs, everything you've already purchased in Path of Exile 1. Almost anyone dedicated to POE1 will try POE2. The marketing makes complete sense from GGG's point of view. I still would love to see some endgame showcases with streamers too. That sounds great. All right, next question time. Sometimes beasts or essence monsters in POE1 are way more challenging than map bosses. Will that be different in POE2? They responded and said bosses in POE2 will be far more involved in POE2. They'll have way more mechanics than POE1 bosses like Hailrake. Additionally, rares and other monsters in POE1 have too many multiplicatively stacking modifiers that consistently make them harder than map bosses. This isn't always going to happen in POE2, but it might happen in rare cases. They're hoping to fix this problem in both POE1 and POE2 eventually. Map bosses in POE2 though will be more substantial fights. Zizaran followed up and asked, will mapping specific builds and bossing specific builds be viable, or will a mix be encouraged? They responded and said the intention of a reward in a map is 1/3 from the map boss, 1/3 from the map mobs, and 1/3 from special league mechanics. So potentially if you can clear one of those way faster than the others. Ziz then asked, will map bosses have unique and specific loot? They followed up and said they might consider doing that, but it's not currently the case. Ziz then said again, divination cards for boss drops devalue boss uniques outside the boss fights, and he's talking about pinnacle bosses here. How will div card drops and strictness be approached in POE2? The developers responded and said they don't like boss drops coming from div cards before a boss is even killed. If div cards reach POE2, they might only be limited to world drop items and not boss drop items. Even the void reliquary keys are causing this issue as well. They've been discussing all of this, but they don't have a specific solution down yet. Ziz then followed up again on this question and said, all divination cards are made by supporters. GGG hasn't made any. Will GGG be changing this? They responded and said they do like the fact that some content in the game is player designed, rather than company designed. They want to keep that in POE2. Will they do a design a unique in POE2 though? Hrishi started as a supporter who designed a unique, he was proud about that. It's a massively different task though, designing a unique with a supporter compared to designing one internally. The feeling is amazing, but the cost would be tremendous and painful in many ways. It might be worth it though. The main problem is the after effects. When other items overshadow an initial supporter item, it's tough to grapple with for both the company and the supporter. Ziz then suggested raising the price or making it a raffle, and they followed up and said, well, the most recent time they did this was winning a race. They also don't like people thinking a supporter designer wastes a chance to design a unique and makes, a bad unique. The entire idea is tricky to work with. I do hope they keep doing this, at least with the races, and I do like Zizaran's concept of a raffle. If they don't want to add, as many supporter uniques as people will buy, they should do a raffle once a league where you can say, okay, I'm willing to pay $500 to design a unique, put your name in there, and if they choose your name, well, you get to work with the devs. I do also like the racing idea. What happened with Ziz and everybody else who won those boss kill races, their uniques are pretty awesome, and I love them being able to design them because they have a good idea of how the game functions. Okay, next question. Are there any supporter-related things transferring to POE2? They answered and said they won't directly go to POE2. Some uniques will. Mostly iconic uniques will be in POE2 in some form. If a supporter unique is iconic, it will reach POE2. Okay, off the top of my head, I don't know many iconic supporter uniques. I don't even know many supporter uniques, honestly, but that is good to know that lots of iconic uniques are going to be in the game. I imagine stuff like Headhunter will be in there, all the Calm items, Mage Blood at this point really seems to be iconic, although flasks work completely differently. It's going to be interesting to see which batch they see as iconic once we finally get our hands on Path of Exile 2. Here we go, next question time. Cosmetics in POE1 are tied to a specific piece of armor. In POE2, will those just be effects you can apply to your character? They responded and said, if they divorce the cosmetic completely from the function, it becomes muddled. It's easier to work on in conjunction, but they understand why players want to separate them. MTX changes are in the works and they will affect both games. The slot-based system is holding them back, but there are cases when you do not want to use this. Something like a list would work better. Great to hear that they're working on this. We know that they're working on an MTX preview, and this too, what Ziz brings up, being able to attach certain effects that you don't want to be wearing the armor pieces for. I know a lot of people have the flying from last year's supporter packs, and they want to use it without using that armor set. I'm a big fan and totally agree with that. As someone who gets 40 out of 40 and has lots of different effects I'd like to use when not wielding specific pieces of armor. All right, question 6 time. Does Detonate Dead need to be tied to corpse health when it is a monster ability? They respond and say, the player's skill needs to be tied to corpse life. Most definitely. Why wouldn't the monster version also scale with this as long as the tell is there? The tell is the most important part, and that's the current problem with POE1. Zizaran responds and says, should it become undefendable? And they respond, that's not always ideal, but in super rare cases where it is clearly evident, instant death is okay. Yeah, we know they're changing this to be far more telling in Path of Exile 1 and in Path of Exile 2, and we'll see what actually plays out in 3.24. Next question time. How are you making monsters dangerous in Path of Exile 2? They respond and say, the mechanics of the average POE1 monster are less complicated than in POE2, meaning there will be more complexity in each battle in POE2. Ziz responds and says, like rare mods, what will there be? And they respond and say, they will be there, but they won't need on-death effects always to make things hard in POE2. There's not just one thing that makes the encounters harder per se, it's a conglomeration. Ziz then pressed them a little bit and said, well, which mechanics do you like? Do you like on-death mechanics? And they responded and said, oh, well, we like on-death mechanics because it means you have something to play around when you're battling a pack. It inserts care into the encounter. Ideally, there should be more than that, though. They didn't point out anything specifically, but you know, they probably have it in the back of their mind, and they're probably not the people exactly designing the exact monster mods and monster mechanics. And it seems like, from what we've seen in POE2, many of the hard monster fights aren't going to come from the modifiers on the rares, but the actual monster mechanical abilities built into the monster type. Okay, another question. Do you pause when talking to a vendor in POE2? They respond and say it's something they could do. It is lame getting attacked when speaking to a vendor or doing another task. Their preferred solution would be not allowing monsters to aggro onto you, but this could be abused. It's frustrating though and should be fixed. Yeah, they did elaborate and kind of say, yep, we're looking into it. We really want to fix this in POE1 and POE2, but there's so many different cases where you could abuse it, and they definitely don't want that to happen with all the clever players in Path of Exile. Juicy question time. Have you considered making early game respeccing more accessible in POE2? Right now, it's almost a disservice to tell new players to experiment. They responded and said, they all think it's vital people understand what happens to you when you allocate passives. They need to solve people understanding what each point will do to them. That's the real solution here. Perhaps they'll have the ability to respec rewarded passive points, but you need solidification of your character. In POE2, there are more generic nodes at the beginning. This should help. They then debated for quite a while about the ease of respeccing at 100, how it's hard on new players to completely restart, and how GGG would like to keep it frictional to respec. They don't like the primary feeling that your character is just a machine. They want it to have a feeling and identity, and changing it completely should take a bit of time and cost a good amount. Since this comes up a ton though, they will discuss it further. It's quite important to GGG when players have problems. There should be no excuses in POE2. That's their design philosophy. And yes, we'll see later in the interview, they are not backing down from any questions. They're willing to answer and change even their most fundamental philosophies that they've held for years in this franchise. Next question. Can we have later private leagues that will be voided in POE1 or POE2? They respond and say, the big problem is destroying how Path of Exile plays in the real non-private leagues. You lose your aspirational goals and can trivialize the normal game experiences with private leagues that have positive mods. It's not a question of playtime. They do not want to compromise the feeling of accomplishment for others. They do not want to devalue experiences. This is the exact reason they do not buff drop rates in SSF. However, their stance on it is softening, because in Trade League, it's much easier to get items in trade. They could possibly be upping drop rates in SSF quite a bit, but they wouldn't allow you to transfer SSF characters to Trade Leagues. They did reference Last Epoch here, and it's definitely interesting and something they might think about doing in regards to their trade system. Wow, Last Epoch is already making the rounds, everybody. It's changing fundamentally how trade operates in Path of Exile 1 and 2. And once again, hint to later in the interview. Short question here. Ziz has always wanted to do a group find style league in POE2. Would it be possible? You can only trade and play with each other, and you have a limited life pool. GGG responded and said this is not top of mind for them. It's not top priority. It's cool, but they would need to find time. It's cool, but they would need to find time to do it. Makes total sense. It'll affect a very small population of players, maybe some of the biggest players around, but a small population nonetheless. Question 12. Would an enemy skill filter be too silly in POE2 to help with visual clarity? I don't want to see auto attacks, but I do want to see volatiles. GGG did not love this idea. If this is still a problem in POE2, which they don't think it will be, the idea of not seeing skills is wild and bothers them greatly. Ziz followed up and said, do you hate all terms of opacity, like 30% less monster mods or removing effects of friends? They followed up and said, if you turned down opacity of effects, the effects would probably break. Technically, they would look entirely different. If you have to do this, then grinding your games feels they have screwed up. In POE1, it's definitely a thing, but it better not be needed in POE2. Wow, if this is really true, it's probably not true in group scenarios, right, everybody? But if this is true in a solo sense, that is an insane thought. That will actually have complete visual clarity at all times, and that is their goal. Wow. Whew. We really need to get our hands on Path of Exile 2 as soon as possible. Quick question here. Will Pinnacle bosses be similar in POE2 wherein you can roll modifiers, and will they have specific modifiers on invitations? They responded and said the systems will be different, so it's irrelevant to POE2. However, it's something to mention to Mark Roberts and the POE1 team. What? Okay, so last interview, they did say that, okay, the systems are going to be very similar. What you love in POE1 is going to be in POE2. And then they come out and they say that invitations won't exist, at least in their current form, right? So that does lend itself to quite a few changes. That's entirely how boss fights work in POE1. Interesting thought, and we have some changes incoming for Endgame in POE2. All right, next question. Have you considered rolling positive mods on maps in POE2? Well, they responded and said they used to have a positive mod like pack size or area is a maze in POE1, then everybody tried to roll these mods every single map. Thusly, they removed the positives and distributed said positives to all mods, in this regard, pack size. Why is it bad if everyone wants to try and roll for a specific outcome? They kind of question themselves. They don't see why there is a bad reason to have positive only modifiers. It might need to do with having mandatory chores to run maps, which already does happen quite a bit in POE1, but they kind of want to get away from in POE2. Ooh, interesting. So will this cycle of juicing be completely different in POE2? Will we even have the juice available at the outset? Because a lot of the juice in POE1 came in over the years. But that's one of the goals of POE2. It's transferring many of the different systems in POE1 in a beautiful and smooth way to POE2. I think a lot of people are going to hope that the juice is still there. Okay, next question, and an interesting one at that. Ziz hates cycling damage reduction mods in POE1. They feel like immunities from Diablo 2. Will they be in POE2? GGG responded and said, when there's no counterplay, immunities suck. In D2, having two elements was the counterplay to immunity to certain elements. They like it adding dimensions to your build you need to focus on. They as designers truly do enjoy this. Players do not. They like focusing on their one thing. In POE1, because of how 6-linking works, it's hard to focus on more than one thing. In POE2, you have many 6 links and dual specializations. This makes it way more possible to swap. They will not be doing full immunities, but some resistances will be more punitive. They do think you should hit monsters that frustrate you, not all the time, but in certain times. After the podcast, Mark Roberts messaged Ziz and removed complete immunity from cycling damage reduction in POE as well. Nice. I agree with needing to run into very difficult monsters at times, but I do appreciate the fact nothing will be completely immune to your attacks as they were in D2, or like they pretty much were in POE1 with cycling damage reduction. Glad to see that's not happening in POE2, even if you can counterplay with all the different possibilities we are going to have with our various skills and attacks on our characters. Okay, big question here. Identification made more sense in games like Baldur's Gate. Why does grinding your games like identifying items? They respond and say, this goes back to the town cycle. You've done a map, you have a bunch of items, now it's time to go back to town. In POE2, you can talk to the ID all NPC, then you see all your identified items. You also get 2 moments of intrigue with IDing. When you see an item on the ground and pick it up, then once you identify it. It's hard to appreciate with the sheer number of items dropping in POE1. It should be much better in POE2. They tried smart loot out in POE1 with Talisman and Heist, but they took a kinda wrong approach. They somewhat told people which mods were good by making them well-rolled and rolling certain mods. They don't want to tell players what is good in POE2. They want players to figure it out. Okay, so that's interesting. I know they're bringing down the dilution of the mod pool in Path of Exile 2, but they're also not going to have preset rolled mods. That's kind of what I thought they might be leaning toward with well-rolled rares and the lesser amount of rares that will drop on the ground, but it does sound like there will be that random factor in there, and you'll still need to puzzle together which mods work well together and create that perfect item. That's good. That's good. Okay, good question here. Will there be drop-only mods in POE2? They like the concept, but if the best items come from specific content and cannot drop anywhere, they wouldn't want that. Thusly, every item you start with would have to come from a specific place for all characters. Incursion mods might be a good example. You want mods to be good for certain builds to drop from specific locations, but you don't want everyone to start from the same location with the same mods from the same pool. There will be drop-only mods in POE2, but they're going to make sure that they follow their own guidelines. Veiled items are a little bit different in this regard because many of them are just obviously better than base mods, so they have to look at something like that before they implement it in POE2. Additionally, they will have battle orbs in POE2, and they are not sure about adding recombinators. Wow, I cannot believe they added recombinators to POE1, and now we're never going to see them ever again, when it was one of the coolest, most accessible ways to build your own items. Very unfortunate, and I hope they find a good way to put this back in one of their titles. Maybe it will be in Path of Exile Mobile, everybody. Next question. Will there be rules around pausing? Party leaders might be able to set rules, they said, like only they can pause. There will also be no limits on pausing. They'll need to design boss mechanics around that. Like the Maven memory game wouldn't be possible with pausing. It'd be too easy to memorize and write it down while paused. However, they might black out the screen during certain boss mechanics. And you just jolt back into the game when you unpause. There is no countdown. That's hilarious, thinking that the screen is going to black out when you pause the game in POE2. I can see it happening, and I can see people abusing the heck out of this mechanic. Another short question. If there was an invitation system in POE2, instead of being droppable things like they needed to grind for, they could function like Atlas memories, perhaps? Again, they aren't talking about the POE2 endgame. Ziz should talk to Mark about it. Okay, they're staying quiet on this endgame. They're probably working on it right now. We only have about 4 months remaining until we get our hands on it. I can't wait to see what it looks like. Question number 20. POE2 is much prettier than POE1. How do you balance making it look so much nicer while optimizing how well systems can run it? They answered and said, system requirements for POE2 are higher than POE1 for the start of the game. An NVIDIA 960 is the minimum requirement. It should be rather accessible, although it won't be the prettiest, but it will be 60 FPS. The Wildwood in POE1 is using the same tech and assets as POE2. You should have a good grasp on how POE2 will run based on this content. It's not much more expensive. But before we discuss that fully, I would like to ask, if you are enjoying this video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the sub notification bell. More content like it is on the way. Thank you for the consideration, and if you do like the video, the support. Alrighty, let's get back to it. Well, that's good to hear, everybody. So we're already pretty much beta testing all the new engine improvements, all the new graphics in Path of Exile 1. Go into the Wildwood, see what your FPS is like, see how it compares to regular POE1, and see what the improvement, if there is any, is like. Okay, next question, and I loved this question. It sounds like we will be incentivized to use multiple skills in POE2. How will you do that without cooldowns? They responded and said, the advantage you get for using a skill in the correct situation must be high, higher than using the same skill over and over. This means there's no need to artificially restrict skills if organic situations arise. For example, your single target skill might do way less than another skill to a huge number of monsters. Say it's 10 times less. You're super incentivized to then use the AoE skill in certain cases with big packs. Great, succinct, easy example, and that makes total sense. You won't be making your single target skills do massive amounts of AoE damage with something like Ancestral Call, as you do in POE1. You're going to have a dedicated skill for those massive AoE situations. Okay, next question. Will all uniques have a purpose in POE2? Yes, uniques are puzzle pieces. Maybe they won't combo with something immediately, but later on they will. Hrishi said it sometimes takes a while to figure out when a unique is valuable. Person A might not see a unique as valuable, but person B definitely will. Their philosophy isn't truly changing from POE1 to POE2. Leveling uniques will also still exist. In fact, they've been doing low-level unique design for POE2 in the last month. It's fun stuff compared to POE1 uniques. This is exciting, and remember, there's going to be at least one unique for every base type in POE2, and there are at least 700 base types. That's a wild number. And we're getting all the iconics in Path of Exile 2 as well. Another unique question. Are unique items as a whole approached differently in POE2? They said, it might not be much different. They'd now just know what works and doesn't work after years of experience. Uniques should have cost to put on. Not all of them will have life or resistances. They don't want to use that, but it means if a unique doesn't have life, the unique property should be powerful enough or unique enough to sacrifice the life or resistance cost. Additionally, they also don't want every slot on your character to be unique. They want a mix of rares and uniques. Makes sense, and yeah, that's the same philosophy as they have in POE1. Next question. With player item quantity removed, will player item rarity be a prefix and suffix? Very specific Magic Find question here from Zizaran. They said, on some slots, it is a prefix and a suffix, but not all slots. On helmets and jewelry, It's a prefix and a suffix. There you go, Magic Find enjoyers. Enjoy. Another unique question. With unique items, will there be big new things with technological advancements like extra passive points and such? Well, they responded and say it wasn't impossible in POE1, it would just take a ton of time to implement all the possible use cases. Technologically, there's nothing major, but many systems have changed. Conversion has been reworked, so has Leech in POE2. When systems change, it allows for more design space. In one regard, it's way easier to make new animations and unique rigging, so we can have custom stuff with unique items in POE2. There can be custom skills on uniques with custom animations. You could have a weapon that charges up visually. Then, you can use a special ability when it's fully charged, and it shows that on the weapon. The tech is there because everything is now modern in the engine. Oh, and I know your interest was piqued with the Leech hint right there. Well, Ziz's was too. The next question, how does Leech work in POE2? They respond and say it's super simple. An item has X% damage of physical damage Leech. Then, monsters have Leech resistance now. That's it. Leech scales off damage. Monster resistance scales linearly too. Leech resistance is not to make bosses immune to Leech, it's to prevent exponential scaling with damage and Leech. Also, Val Pact is back and it makes Leech instant. Life regeneration works the same as before, but they've reworked how quickly you can recover life. Interesting and good to hear. I'm glad that Leech is back in Path of Exile 2 and we won't need to fully reside on flasks for healing. Good news all around. I don't want to spam 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. A few really quick questions here, and then we have the juicy one. Will there be a new tier of item in POE2? No. No set items and no new tiers. Pants, though, will be in the boot art, though. Next question, will there be chase items? Yes, you need them. That's awesome to hear. They didn't say that they would be on the same power scale as stuff like Mage Blood or Headhunter, but they will be uber powerful uniques in Path of Exile 2. And then everybody, here is the massive question that led into a huge answer from Jonathan that I am going to link in the description below because listening to his full response is well worth the time. Will services be itemized more in POE2, like Eisling slams? They respond and say yes. They are actively trying to avoid that situation in POE2, and in the next POE1 league, there is a lot of stuff being itemized in POE1. Jonathan basically delivered a speech on the spot about trade in Path of Exile, all the changes upcoming, and essentially how they're destroying TFT in POE2. Essentially, they are making an auction house and they will be taxing the buyer with account-bound gold in Path of Exile 2. ARPGs will no longer accept trading without instant buyouts. Wild, wild, wild. Like I said, for those who would like to watch it in full, I cannot give it justice. I linked to it in this chapter below. They are actually changing their philosophy. I'm shocked. You will be limited by your slots in your stash to sell items, which means if you want to sell a lot, you'll need to buy stash tabs. Again, this seems like a POE2 only feature for now. POE1 needs a feature like this, but it won't happen before POE2 goes to beta, although lots of itemization of services is happening. Okay, everyone, me here now. This is probably the biggest change that we've heard about between Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2. I have been the firmest believer that they will never change trade in Path of Exile, but there's just been a perfect storm. There's Last Epoch announcing how they're doing trade in their system. You can look it up. Lots of content creators have covered it. Plus, 11th Hour Games does a great job covering it themselves. And then there's been the whole TFT, the Forbidden Trove fiasco that I have not covered on this channel, but it has been humongous in the Path of Exile community and lots of people are talking about it. This has caused GGG to completely alter their philosophy and actually implement an auction house for Path of Exile 2. I'm shocked. This is wild. Definitely the biggest news of this interview. 3 quick more questions though. Will POE2 have global announcements? Yes, there will be. We'll have to see if there's room for more. Next question, why are Masteries removed in POE2? Masteries are just nodes in the tree now. You need to find them on the tree. And then finally, pineapple on pizza, yay or nay? Hrishi said absolutely not. Jonathan said absolutely yes. What a great interview. Thank you to Zizaran for conducting it, and thank you to Hrishi and Jonathan Rogers for being such great interviewees. It's obvious the Path of Exile developers keep consistently learning from their mistakes, from the early POE1 days to what they're accomplishing with POE2. Blizzard is not learning from past mistakes they've made or from problems in competitor games. Here's a great video on how they refused to learn from Path of Exile 1 while developing Diablo 4. Watch it now.